afternoon. My name is Jeff Scal with the Florida Association of Counties. Today we have a joint webinar and a great panel for you all. A joint webinar with FAC and ICG. Today's webinar is on the future of water resources planning and funding, options and opportunities. Joining us today on our panel, we have Frank Bernardino from Anfield Consulting and John Kaliski from Cambridge Systematics. We will get to them in just a minute, but I also want to introduce our Water and Environmental Sustainability Chair, Ken Cornell from Alachua County, our Vice Chair, Mayor Michelle Coldiron from Monroe County, and joining us a little bit later and on the screen still is Commissioner Doug Smith. And now I'll turn it over to Chair Cornell.
Thank you, Jeff. What an exciting day today is. I want to thank the staff at FAC for organizing what we've been working on for the last couple of months, which is to have two of the state's premier experts on this issue that Doug has brought forward, Commissioner Smith has brought forward with regards to planning for the future of our water resources. We've been working on this for many, many years. You've all heard me say water is an economic issue, and it is the primary issue that I think folks come to Florida. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our vice chair for some opening remarks, and then we'll get some great bios of our two guests from Jeff. So Madam Vice Chair, give us some remarks.
Thank you, Chair Cornell. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be sitting up here with my esteemed colleagues and the panel of professionals that we've brought forth. You know, as I said a couple of months ago, Mark Twain says, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And we are now in the fight of our life to not only protect this natural resource we have, but also the challenges we're facing with how are we going to come up with a funding source that will be predictable, that will be annual, and that will have a fair, equitable distribution statewide. So I am truly honored to be here with you. Thank you to our staff. And with that, I turn the floor back over to you, Chair Cornell.
Thank you, Vice Chair Coldiron. All right, Jeff, why don't we do some intros? What we're going to do today, folks, we've got close to 30 people participating, is we'll have two presentations, about 20 minutes long each, a lot of information for you to absorb, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions in the chat. And with that, Jeff, why don't we do some intros?
Absolutely, Chair. So first we have Frank Bernardino from who's a partner at Anfield Consulting, boutique consulting firm, lobbying firm specializing in water and environmental resources management, serving both public and private clients. He has over 36 years of experience working in Florida's environmental, political, and governmental arenas. Frank holds a master's degree in biology and a bachelor's of science degree in environmental studies, both from Florida International University. Mr. Bernardino was well-versed in challenging arenas of environmental and growth management regulation, and he's a recipient of the Florida Senate's prestigious Medallion of Excellence for his dedicated service in protecting Florida's natural resources. Mr. Bernardino is widely recognized as one of the most effective environmental advocates in the state, and I will turn it over to Frank.
Okay, thank you, and my appreciations to both chairs for inviting me to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully we'll be able to get right into the presentation. Well, as always, in Tallahassee, there's a lot of discussions about solutions that are in search of a problem. That's not our case here. We definitely have a problem, and I'm going to walk you through some information. Some of you may have seen this presentation in different iterations previously, but I always have new nuggets, and hopefully it'll drive the point home. So one of the outcomes of the efforts of FAC's advocacy was that in 2016, we passed Senate Bill 552. The bill addressed many issues, but inside that bill was the requirement that the state take a look at the comprehensive water supply needs of the state and to also forecast the infrastructure needs related to all areas of water. In their most recent publication, they documented that in the 10-year forecast that they do every year, by the end of that 10 years, the state of Florida is going to have our $840 million shortfall in the amount of funding that will be required to just keep pace. This is not to build upon new programs and new initiatives that are started by the state. This is just to keep pace with the ones that we already have. when you look at that and the last 4 years that they published that forecast, the numbers just keep getting worse. We keep getting further and further into the hole. But not significant is not just the fact that overall we're getting deeper into the hole, but in every year of their forecast going forward, it's not just the last year, it's every year in between, the numbers keep getting worse. You can see the trend, pick any year, the gap keeps getting larger and larger. What are the real numbers? These are come straight out of their report, and you can see whether it's water supply or water quality, and I'll give you a minute to digest some of the figures that are there, or we're talking about restoration of the Everglades. If you exclude any adaptation for sea level rise, if you add up all of those numbers in the previous slide, the state of Florida is going to need approximately $66 billion over the next 20 years to meet this challenge. So where's that money going to come from? These are the traditional sources of funding that we have in Florida. First, the Water Management District. Second is programmatic funding that occurs every year in the state budget. And last but not least, something that I'm sure many of you invest a lot of time and energy in, are line item appropriations. As you know, Florida has 5 water management districts divided by hydrologic boundaries, and their collective budgets changed drastically in 2007 when we hit the Great Recession. At that point, between 2008 and 2009, you saw about a 23% drop in property values, and their revenue commensurate with that change dropped significantly. Further, in 2010, the legislature, trying to give the voters some additional tax relief, lowered the rates by an additional almost 30%. So in combined, we see that there was about a 50% decrease in the ad valorem revenues. Why this is significant is because this is the primary source of funding for the water management districts. But we did something else. We also passed a law that you are also subject to, which basically says that if you're going to collect more dollars, even if the rate of taxation for property values isn't changing, you have to advertise that additional revenue that you want to keep as a tax increase. And as most of you know, in Florida, we don't do tax increases. So what we've seen is that the water management district revenues have pretty much been capped. You see that in the last 10 years, their revenues have barely increased from within. And where there has been an increase, it hasn't been due to ad valorem collections. It's been due to other programs that the districts administer that have yielded that difference. When you look at the overall picture of all of the revenues that are collected by the water management districts, you saw a decrease in $1 billion worth of resources available to them in a 5-year window between 2007 and 2012. We have slowly climbed from the low of $612 million to the nearly $1.5 billion that we are now, but that is mostly due to subsidies that they receive from the state. So the state has taken on the responsibility of meeting the gap in order to fund the many programs that we're trying to implement throughout the state. This is a very important slide for commissioners, and what it shows is that the level of support that you can expect from the districts vary depending upon where you live. Most significant, though, is in South Florida, where the agency is pretty much focused on Everglades restoration, and as a consequence does not provide funding for the implementation of water supply or flood control projects. This is very significant because as we look into the future and dealing with issues of sea level rise and adaptation for sea level rise, the Water Management District does not have the ability to raise revenues because they're capped with regard to ad valorem collections. And so any plan that they would seek to implement is entirely dependent upon appropriations, either from the state or the federal government. When we talk about member water projects, this is not a source that you want to build a program around. It is completely unreliable, as you can see in this graphic. Even though we have done better in the last 4 years, the numbers have begun to increase again. Overall, this is not a consistent source, and that's reflected in the amount of projects that get vetoed every year. On average, over the last 16 years, 1 in 4 projects get vetoed roughly, and the same with regard to the amount. Now, state programmatic funding is the funding that you can depend on. This is tends to, in general, be more consistent. And what you see here across the bottom, a lot of acronyms, let me help you out with them. This Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Program is this number that you see that I'm pointing to. The Wastewater State Revolving Loan, again, the other state loan program. These are funds that are not grants. This is dollars that you have to repay. have come in fairly consistently between the $1 and $200 million number. Everglades restoration by far is where the state makes the majority of its investments, last year exceeding $500 million. Springs has gotten consistently $50 million a year, beginning with 2016. It was added to the Land Acquisition Trust Fund recurring revenue source. And so it sailed consistently at 50 million. This year, they got an additional 50 million out of the American Rescue Act. The state has consistently done investments, again, in the $50 million area for agricultural best management practices and total maximum daily loads, both programs that are intended to help restore our water bodies. The new addition is, and you don't see the last letter here, is resilience. And we had a trickle over the last 4 years, but this year, in large part due to $500 million they invested from the American Rescue Act, you see that resiliency is spending pretty much equals Everglades restoration. It is important to note, though, that but for that one-time infusion of federal dollars, that graph next year will drop back to $100 million. They did establish a $100 million recurring revenue stroke for Resiliency Florida. By contrast, the state revenues are largely state funds that are cooked into the state budget and come off the top every year. When we look then at the total investment of the state in water infrastructure, these are state dollars, again, not federal dollars. We see that the state has, over the last few years, in large part due to our advocacy efforts, invested more money into water infrastructure. But again, when you look at that investment as part of the overall budget of the state, you see that we're still below 1% of the state. We've averaged over this period of 16 years of about half of 1% of the state budget goes to water infrastructure. Last year was our best year, nearly reaching 1%, but not quite getting there. By contrast, then you look at the investment that the state makes in highway infrastructure. And what we find is that the state spends approximately $1 on water for every $10 that it spends on roads. And this is significant because somehow we have wired ourselves when we talk about infrastructure to placing roads first. If you look at the recent legislation that was passed by Congress, and you look at the numbers that are going to come from the infrastructure bill to Florida, there's $13.1 billion that are going to come for roads. And by contrast, only $1.6 billion for water. So for some reason, we have built this system that places emphasis when we talk about infrastructure and highway infrastructure. So what are the 5 areas that we're going to seek to address and are going to need to address in any plan going forward? Obviously, drinking water supply, wastewater, stormwater, and ecosystem restoration. The new one, had we done this presentation 5 years ago, resilience wouldn't have been there because the state as a whole has just begun to make significant strides in investment in this area. Rest assured, they're all interrelated. When you talk about wastewater, you're talking about reclaiming water and potentially making it a source of drinking water, potentially using some water to accomplish ecosystem restoration. So all of these are interrelated disciplines that any effort that we engage in the future is going to have to address. And with that, I am done with my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Frank. That was a lot less than 20 minutes. You were flying. I appreciate that. All right, Jeff, let's get our next guest.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Chair. And next joining us, we have John Kaliski from Cambridge Systematics. He is a principal there with the firm's national practice lead for transportation planning and management. He currently is working with the Florida Department of Transportation. He's currently working with the Florida Department of Transportation to update the Florida Transportation Plan, and he recently completed work with the Florida Chamber Foundation to develop the Florida 2030 Strategic Blueprint for the future of Florida's economy. He has led strategic planning, visioning, or research efforts for a wide range of Florida organizations, including the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, Career Source Florida, Orlando Economic Partnership, Tampa Bay Partnership, Palm Beach North Chamber of Commerce, South Florida Regional Planning Council, and the Central Florida Regional Planning Council. And next will be John's presentation.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And just want to make sure everyone can see my screen here.
Yeah, we're good.
All right. And thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Vice Chair, for the opportunity to be with you today. I've been reached out through Commissioner Smith about the possibility of sharing how Florida's long-range transportation planning process works as a potential model for thinking about water planning statewide. And so it's a privilege to take a few moments to share about that. I also am very pleased to have Allison Stetner on the line as well. And Allison is the director of the Office of Policy Planning with the Florida Department of Transportation. And so she lives and breathes this daily and is also available for any questions. Almost every state agency in Florida has some type of long-range planning process, whether we're talking economic development, workforce, emergency management, health, and so forth. What's unique about the transportation planning process is that similar to what you're talking about for water, it's a very long-range process that has a 20+ year long-range planning nested within a 5-year sort of capital planning process to identify and fund projects, and also involving a very large range of partners and involving a large amount of investment needs as well. So I'm going to touch briefly on a couple of things. We'll talk a little bit about the Florida Transportation Plan, which is the state's long-range transportation plan. We'll talk about the strategic intermodal system, which is the element of this long-range plan that's really focused on what's the facilities of statewide significance, how that ties to the department's 5-year work program, and then how we coordinate with regional local plans and manage performance over time to targets. And then I'll also touch on the role of the Florida Transportation Commission. Just to kind of start, the Florida Transportation Plan is the state's long-range plan. It's a plan for all of Florida. So FDOT, the Department of Transportation, is the convening agency to develop the Florida Transportation Plan, but it really is viewed as a plan that's developed by a wide range of partners. And we'll kind of show you a number of the partners who are involved in a moment. The intent is to provide long-range policy guidance for all transportation partners in the state, and also the policy framework for expenditure of both state and federal transportation funds. It is sort of in statute, section 339.155. It's sort of an interesting situation that by federal law and rule, every state is required to develop a long-range transportation plan. Florida is one of the states that has it in state statute as well. And also puts a time horizon on it. So this plan is required to be updated at least once every 5 years. A lot of other states do this on a frequent basis. Often it's when the federal legislation gets updated or when there's a significant event in the state. So there are some states that will go 10, 15, 20 years without updating their plans, but Florida is very disciplined about doing this every 5 years. And you can see the elements of the statute here. It covers all modes. It's a period of 20 years plus. There's prevailing principles in statute to consider of preserving infrastructure, supporting the economy, mobility, and the state's role as a hub for trade and investment, and requirements for coordinating with partners, including metropolitan planning organizations and local government officials. Part of the reason that the Florida Transportation Plan is so broad is that Florida's transportation system is so large and diverse. And this slide just kind of shows all the different modes of the transportation in the state and who owns them. And so one thing to keep in mind is that the state, through Florida DOT, owns the state highway system. They own some parts of other modes, but for the most part, the transportation system in Florida is owned by local governments. It's owned by independent authorities, it's owned by special districts, some of it's owned by the private sector. And so the goal here is to kind of have a plan to get really everybody pointing in the same direction in terms of the transportation future of the state. And so for this reason, there's a very large and diverse steering committee that oversees the FTP process. This is not required in statute, but it's how Florida DOT has been leading this process, recognizing the value of that long-term partnership. So local governments, MPOs, regional planning councils, every mode of transportation, the business community, environmental groups, and so forth. I do want to recognize Commissioner Smith, who's been the FAC representative to this committee for several years. And also I noticed Commissioner Parks on the line, who's been representing Team Florida as a member of this steering committee. And And one of the things that changed with this committee in the last cycle is in the past, FDOT would establish a steering committee every 5 years to assist them in updating the Florida Transportation Plan. When the committee was wrapping up its work in 2015, there was a discussion of, given all the uncertainty the state is facing, keeping the steering committee intact to assist with implementation and continue that coordination across all the partners. So the same committee has been meeting for going on 7 years now. They've helped the department with 2 updates of the FTP and with implementation of both of those as well. And so that's really been a very significant long-term partnership. The FTP is organized in 4 elements. And again, this is not something that's in statute, but is how this plan has evolved over time. So there's a vision element that's really looking out 25 years plus, what's our vision for transportation in Florida. There's a policy element that's within the 25-year horizon, specific objectives and strategies. A 5-year implementation element that identifies specific short-term actions to begin moving towards all of these goals. Then a performance element that gets updated on a regular basis to track, are we making progress? Are we moving the needle? And so this structure has been very helpful over time at both pointing towards a long-range vision, but at the same time, specific actionable items that can get done in the short term. And just to show a few highlights from the current Florida Transportation Plan, these are the 7 goals of the FTP. And as you can see, they cover some of the traditional topics that are always very important to transportation, safety of the system, the quality and resilience of the infrastructure, the mobility for people and freight, but they also look at how does transportation support other statewide goals. So supporting access to opportunity, the strength of the economy, the quality of our communities and environment. And for large part, these goals have been largely consistent over the past few plans. In fact, that's been part of the value of long-range vision tends to get updated every cycle, but is not changing a lot because our vision tends to be these same sets of goals over time. Is how we get there that can change. This slide highlights some of the key strategies that are in the current FTP policy element. And again, a mix of some cross-cutting issues, highlighting the importance of sustainable funding and an investment program that supports all of the goal areas, but also specific strategies in everything from safety to environmental stewardship. And these strategies do change significantly every 5 years when the plan gets updated. So this current version, for example, has a greater emphasis on workforce, has a greater emphasis on risk and resilience, on access to opportunity, and also kind of expanded sort of the definition of infrastructure from a transportation perspective to also look at technology. So recognizing that a lot of the roadside technology and sensors and broadband and such are very important to the future of transportation. What the committee is working on right now is the implementation element that will be wrapped up by the end of this year. And that's as sort of those really short-term actions in each of these areas and sort of gets to what the Department of Transportation can do, but also actions that the partners can do over time. So within that structure of the Florida Transportation Plan being updated every 5 years, a key element that's emerged over time is what's known as the strategic intermodal system. And this was actually recommended out of a FTP update 20 years ago, the idea of identifying the transportation systems across all modes that are important from a statewide perspective, really supporting Florida's economy by connecting Florida regions and by connecting Florida to other states and nations. And so this is the current map of the strategic intermodal system. And I sort of share it because I think there may be a good analogy from a water perspective as well of many different water needs. What are the ones that are really going to emerge of being of statewide significance? And so from a transportation planning perspective, being able to really focus the state's role on this subset has been very significant in terms of focusing resources. There is a parallel planning process that's been set up over time for the strategic intermodal system that includes a policy plan that's updated every 5 years following the Florida Transportation Plan, and then kind of a series of plans, everything from an unfunded needs plan down to cost feasible plan, what can we do in the next 20 to 25 years, and then a 5-year work program, what can we do in the next 5, and then sort of a set of projects that are identified for years 6 through 10. So there's on a continual basis that list of what are we going to do immediately in 5 years, what's sort of in that holding pen for years 6 to 10, almost ready to go, and then sort of a longer term list of both projects we think we can fund and projects that are unfunded at this time. I didn't put in Frank had some great slides on some of the unfunded needs. I didn't put the numbers in here because they're all going to need to get updated with this new Florida Transportation Plan and reflect the changes over the last few years that we've seen, as well as the new federal bill that was just signed this week. But just as one example, the last unfunded needs plan just for the strategic intermodal system, and this was 4 years ago, was over $106 billion over that time period. So it's some very significant numbers, obviously, from both the transportation and water perspective in terms of future investment. All of this then feeds into the 5-year work program, and the FDOT has a work program that gets updated every year on an annual basis. That flow chart down the right, I know it's a little small to read, but it sort of goes through the steps of how that's pulled together, really bottom up, getting input from all of the districts and metropolitan planning organizations and local governments around the state, identifying priorities consistent with the goals and objectives of the Florida Transportation Plan, and then balancing that against available revenues. And again, this is a federally required to have a statewide transportation improvement program, but Florida has sort of done this as a 5-year basis as a work program that gets updated annually based on the best available revenue forecast. And generally, when a project is identified as part of this work program, it is consistent with the long range plan. And it's something that there's a commitment to fund, assuming the revenues hold up as intended over that time period. And just a quick snapshot of the current work program. This is the one that began this current fiscal year in July and will carry through June of 2026. So it's about a $51 billion work program over that 5-year period. About half of the funding are from state sources. So that's the motor fuel tax, the aviation fuel tax, a portion of the documentary stamp proceeds, and some of the other state rental car surcharge, other state sources targeted for transportation. About a quarter is federal aid dollars that come through the Federal Highway Trust Fund to Florida Department of Transportation. A portion is turnpikes and tolls, and then some other miscellaneous revenue sources as well. And how that is allocated, that $51 billion is sort of divided in multiple areas. So about 44% goes to safety, which is the top priority, preservation and maintenance of the existing transportation system, then another other operational needs. Then currently about 36% is allocated to capacity and other enhancements across all the different modes. And there's obviously an additional allocation, down to mode and program area and region of the state. That's all, again, gets ties back ultimately to the Florida Transportation Plan goals and objectives. A couple of topics just want to hit on before I close. So one is the importance of performance management, and this has been a real driver for FDOT and for many other states for a long period of time, but just having that perspective of clear goals and objectives, of setting performance targets that can get tracked and measured over time, financial policies to allocate revenues that are tied to those targets, and then delivering projects and be able to measure, are we moving the needle? And this could be a presentation unto itself, but just an example of some of the current performance targets. Some of these come out of federal rules, some of these come out of state rule or statute. So safety is one of particular importance. Florida is one of the few states that has set a performance target of 0 transportation fatalities and serious injuries. Obviously, we're not at 0 yet, but there is every year as part of that work program development process, a look at what do we need to do to reduce or eliminate fatalities and serious injuries, and how do we allocate funds to do so. The bridge and pavement condition is in statute that 80% of all pavement and 90% of bridges need to meet standards that are set by the department. So there's an annual look at, are we hitting that target, and what's the right level of funding for those programs to make sure we're doing so. Reliability is an example of a federal requirement that's looked at travel time reliability on both the interstates and other major highways. And then there's other measures that are being developed for other modes and programs over time. I think you're probably all familiar that FDOT is a decentralized agency. There are 7 different districts around the state that they are responsible for delivering the projects, but also most of them do a lot of planning at a regional and corridor level as well. And so the process is set up to both sort of top down and bottom up, working with the districts. And then, of course, the significant role of the metropolitan planning organizations. There's 27 across Florida that have a statutory role, both from the state and federal perspective, in setting transportation priorities within their areas. So a lot of coordination with them. The counties that are not part of a metropolitan planning organization work directly with their FDOT district, or in some cases with the regional planning council as well. And then finally, just want to touch briefly on the role of the Florida Transportation Commission, which is a sort of a citizens advisory group that was established for transportation in the late 1980s. The commission has 9 members appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate for 4-year terms. They're represent all geographic areas of the state, but really their role is to represent transportation statewide. And one of the requirements is each of them is to have private sector managerial experience. The commission, while administered through FDOT, is an independent commission. Their commissioners are prohibited from any involvement in day-to-day operations or project selection decisions. They do have a role in nominating the candidates for secretary for consideration by the governor, but the main role of the commission is accountability, awareness, and advocacy. And so they have statutory requirements to do an annual oversight and performance monitoring, initially just at FDOT. Today, they also do the same for the other expressway and bridge and transportation authorities that are created in statute. They do an annual evaluation of FDOT's work program to confirm that it meets statutory requirements. And then they look at just potential improvements to FDOT as well as transportation policy initiatives statewide. And so the value of the commission over time has just been having that independent body to identify policy issues that may need some attention, and then also to do their review of FDOT. Is it meeting its performance targets? Is it all the statutory requirements? And again, are we working towards this larger vision? So a few takeaways. I think what's noteworthy about the transportation planning process in Florida, again, is a statutory required long-range planning process that with a requirement to be updated every 5 years, broad-based stakeholder input, not only the committee that I showed you, but each time FDOT updates the Florida Transportation Plan, they reach out. The goal is to reach out to every metropolitan planning organization, every local government, a wide range of the public. We had about 15,000 people involved the last time this was updated. Focusing within that on the system of statewide significance, having the clear linkage from the long-range plan to the 5-year work program so that the projects that are being funded ultimately are supporting the goals and objectives of the long-range plan and sort of making decisions based on performance. Linking to the regional and local plans, so there's a strong consistency between the department and metropolitan planning organizations, as well as the local government comprehensive plans. And then, of course, the dedicated funding sources for transportation, both from the federal government as well as the state revenue sources, is a big part of what makes all of this happen. So I know that was kind of a quick run through of how the transportation planning process works, and happy to take any questions on that. And as mentioned, we have Allison here as well to speak from FDOT's perspective.
Okay, Frank and John, that was excellent presentation. Very, very informative. I presume these slides will be available to our members on the website, Jeff? Can we make that available?
Yes, I'll make sure to talk with Frank and John and see if we can get those up there for you.
All right, so right now, commissioners, would be a time where we've got two of our experts here, obviously completely different areas, water versus transportation. But we're hopefully going to have some good questions, some interaction now. If you go ahead and put your questions in the chat, Jeff will start to go through those. I've got a number of prepared ones if we need some filler time, but Jeff, why don't we go ahead and get started with Q&A? You're muted.
Sure, absolutely, Chair. Let me check into the chat. I see one in there. Florida's system process for transportation planning, coordination, and funding is impressive. How long did this system process take to develop and evolve?
That's a great question. So the first Florida transportation plan was developed in the late 1980s. I don't have the exact date in front of me. So it was actually prior to the federal law changed. IST in 1991 was the first time all the states were required to do so. Florida was a little ahead of the curve. Over time, the process has become more robust and built out. So for example, I believe it was in the late 1990s when they first had the large steering committee process, the committee becoming an ongoing body that continues to meet happened in 2015. The structure used to be a single document, switching into the 4 elements was something that happened around 2015 as well. So it's been some of those cycles over time that kind of help refine that process and look at what's working and what could be enhanced.
Great, thank you, John. And I do see another question in the chat for Frank. Frank, could you summarize Florida's known and projected allocations for the water projects for the federal dollars related to the American Rescue Plan and the $1.2 trillion that's included in the federal infrastructure package?
Sure. With regard to the state of Florida, there was almost $1 billion worth of investment. The overwhelming majority of that went to resiliency projects. So there was $500 million allocated for that. There was also several $100 million that were allocated to the wastewater grant program. I think many of you may have seen that the governor yesterday announced $481 million in wastewater projects throughout the state. The majority of that were federal dollars that came through the American Rescue Act. There was smaller allocations made for Everglades, for Springs restoration, and those were the big 4 programs that were the winners from those particular funds. There was also $50 million allocated to a reservoir project in Palm Beach County, but those were the main takeaways. With regard to the new package, the infrastructure package, we're short on details. The only thing that I've seen so far is the global number, and the global number for Florida over 5 years is $1.6 billion that will come from that package.
And thank you, Frank. And I know, Chair Cornell, you had already mentioned that, yes, these are two very dissimilar presentations that we have, but really to try to bring it all together. And I wanted to let Commissioner Smith chime in here and talk a little bit about the policy proposal that he's offered for the last couple of years, but I'll hand the floor over to Commissioner Smith.
Thanks, Jeff, Mr. Chair, and Madam Vice Chair. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time. And John, part of the thing I hope that we could accomplish with this webinar is to lay out sort of how the framework of the transportation policy system works in Florida. And even though the words are very different, the projects are very different relative from roads to water projects. In my mind, for all the years I've been serving for you all with the Long Range Steering Committee folks, it's the structure that we get out of transportation that I think becomes the advocacy side of this for transportation that really drives the success, if you will, of the program, but also the support of the legislature and the governor. And so what I've always thought about water, all these years we've been talking about water, working on water. And when I say water, I mean all things water. It's not just the water that comes out of your tap. It's the impacts from water and sewer. It's the impacts from Everglades restoration. It's the impacts from runoff. It's the impacts from septic to sewer conversions. It's the coral reef demise of what we're doing out there because of what's running off of our basins. And so as John was running through the structure and all of the different components of transportation that weave in to a long range 5-year and then 20-year horizon, and then how does that relate to water? It's always been our opinion that the advocacy side of this thing is the piece that's missing. And you know, as Frank pointed out in his slides, the up and down of the funding strategies and when there were good years, when there were bad years. And so hopefully for all of us, if we can model this after the transportation program, create our own water program that has this long-standing strategy, planning program, funding strategy, regardless of who's in the legislature, meaning the House or the Senate or the governor's office, the planning process will continue on throughout administrations, throughout Senate presidencies and House speakers, and that there will be a consistent format for water moving into the next 20 years, 30 years. And given the amount of money that's at stake in terms of the size of the projects that are to be worked on, I can't think of a better way really to make sure for our sake as local government that the water policy side gets the same attention, the same advocacy, the same support that the transportation network gets. So I hope it made sense. I hope John's program, you know, that he's outlined for us for transportation, if you can take the word transportation out of that and insert water policy, and then think of everything that's relative to what we do here with water, whether they're springs, whether they're estuaries, whether they're inlets, whether they're Lake Okeechobees, whether they're lakes, septic to sewer, all of those pieces to me are very similar to what we do at transportation. They just have different titles. They just have different names. And the other thing I've tried to, when people have asked me, you know, about this, I've tried to explain to them is, so, you know, look, if you think of transportation and the transportation districts, and you think about water districts, there are certain things in certain parts of the state that parts of the state have that others don't. We don't have any natural springs per se of any great consequence in Martin County, and never will. But there are parts of our state that do. There are other parts of our state that don't have inlets. There are parts of our state that do. Similar to transportation, you know, Cocoa, Melbourne, Titusville will always be our spaceport. Martin County is never going to have a spaceport, but it is a significant piece of our transportation system that is woven into the 5-year, 20-year planning strategy, that every piece of our transportation element, and then therefore every piece of our water element, gets woven into a long-range plan that has that advocacy moving forward in a way that I don't think water has ever benefited from in the past. And again, my opinion is water deserves exactly, if not more so, the same amount of attention as transportation does, because as we've seen in the last 10 years with water, we've had some major meltdowns with our water issues, from blue-green algae to red tide outbreaks on the West Coast, to septic tank issues and so on. We just can't, we as much as transportation is important to Florida, to moving goods and services around and making sure the economy thrives based upon it, water needs that same level of love, and hopefully this kind of mirrored strategy will get us where we need to get for the long range haul. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions, Jeff. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Co-Chair, for giving me the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. So still waiting for some questions in the chat. Frank, while we're waiting on maybe some questions for Doug or anyone else, how would you view, what struck me with John's, well, a lot struck me with John's, but the strategic intermodal system, for those of us that are familiar with MTPO, we know that's where much of that funding goes. How would you view or does the state view a statewide strategic water system? Has that started to get mapped out? Has the legislature started to think in that direction?
Not yet. I think it is on the horizon. I think you alluded to earlier, there are state legislators in both the House and the Senate that are beginning to talk about water in the context of a 5-year work plan similar to the one that the Department of Transportation has. But no one has sat down to actually map it out. One of the things that in my conversations with leadership that I think is necessary is everybody's got to understand our system of water governance dates back to 1972. That's when the water management districts were created. Very little change has occurred with regard to who's in charge of what. Roles were defined then, but over time they become a little bit blurry. Those lines aren't clear anymore. And so consequently, what we have in the water world are a lot of things that I lovingly refer to as orphans. We know that local governments are responsible, for example, for doing drinking water. And you have a rate structure and enterprise funds that is intended to support that. Does it work in all instances? No, but generally it does. But there's a lot of things that are orphans. And because they are orphans, everybody tries to do a little bit towards addressing those areas of water policy, but it's never complete. And so one of the things that I've always felt, and it's no secret to many of you who've known that, Doug and I have been singing basically from the same hymnal for quite some time, is that I believe there is an incredible need in the state of Florida to do that, to look at water much more holistically, look at our foundation that we built 50 years ago, literally 50 years ago, to decide whether it's still working for us. And so what is the Florida SIS system? What would it look like? What are the priorities? Is it a reflection of our values? I'm sorry that I'm going on with the answer, but I'll give you a hypothetical. So and this is truly not the case, but it's just a hypothetical. So we've seen the impacts in Apalachicola Bay due to the water that's not making its way down from Georgia, and the impact that it's had on the hardworking people that depend on that bay for a living. And there's a lot of folks that are thinking about how it is that we're going to implement projects to address that. At the same time, in that same part of the state, virtually no conversations are being had about sea level rise and the impact of sea level rise on those communities. And so you could potentially see a significant investment made towards addressing the habitat needs of Apalachicola Bay, but at the same time, ignoring the competing, in some ways, resiliency challenges that region is going to face. I think that honest conversations need to be had throughout the state to identify our system. What are our true priorities? And then the critical junction, and I think the legislature's inching their way there, is create a funding mechanism in order to make it happen. None of what happens in the transportation world would happen if they weren't as well funded as they are. And we need to accept the fact that all of these things that we need to do are not going to pay for themselves. And we got to come up with a system. But to know what you need to pay for, you need to have a plan. So to me, the plan is that first step.
And thank you for that response. Another kind of question that's come up, Chris has mentioned it, we've all talked about it. John mentioned, DOT has embedded their funding through state statute. Is there state statutes and or constitutional issues that we could be thinking about with regards to governance and setting up systems?
I think there are, and the Deck B that I made reference to in our pre-meeting, I think lays out some of those things, lays out some questions of governance that I think we need to take a hard look at. In my conversations with the state legislature, whenever they see that number 66 billion over 20 years, they get frightened. They're like, wow, we're hardly investing 1 billion now. Where are we going to come up with that kind of money? And the first thing that I remind them is that 6 billion is all in. That's water supply, that's wastewater, that's everything. And they really should only be responsible for part of that pie. But how we identify who's responsible for what part of this challenge and do the mechanisms exist for providing the funding to do that work, that's the critical element. So again, as an example, we know that the state is in the business of water supply. right? The local governments are the ones that are supposed to do water supply. But the state is pushing us all into regional water supply development. Work collaboratively with the local governments near you to implement projects. No one more than George Lindsay, who I believe is on the line, can speak to that. But inherently, there's enormous challenges associated with identifying how we get those projects off the ground and funding them. So for example, one question that could be asked in the light of governance is, would it be more appropriate for the state, who is not in the water supply business, to build the large regional projects and then have the local governments participate by paying for the proportionate share of that project that benefits them? I think questions like that of governance and role and function are going to have to be part of what we talk about in the future if this is to work.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Vice Chair, do you have anything you want to add here while we're waiting on a few more questions?
No, I think I'm agreeing with everyone that the challenge now will be in moving this forward and to come up with a system that is similar to that of the Florida Department of Transportation, and for us to find who will be the leaders in the legislative body that we are going to align ourselves with to accomplish these goals.
Thank you.
Commissioner, if I could add one thing, if I may.
Please.
The one thing, when this concept comes up every now and then, people think, oh my God, another layer of government. It's not another layer of government. There is no layer of government. There is no one that is doing statewide planning for water. It doesn't exist. We have a statewide water plan. I'd challenge any of you to find it. And if you have, to take the dust off of it, because it's probably been sitting in your shelf for a while without anybody paying attention to it. So it isn't the fact that we're going to increase layers of bureaucracy that are going to make the things that we need to do harder. It's that we're going to acknowledge that we have a massive challenge ahead of us, and we're not going to do anything about it if we're not talking about it
Right.
together.
Right. Very good. All right, Jeff, you got anything else in the chat?
I do see a couple questions here. They're asking about what are some of the trade-offs that local and regional interests would have to accept to move forward with the statewide strategic plan, and what are the advocacy networks for accomplishing those? I think that could be regional planning councils, some MPOs, resiliency coalitions, but I'll defer over to Frank on that too.
I want to hear from Frank too, but John, you're like the Harvard degree where we want to get to. Where, walk us through how you would see us setting this up with the legislature.
Yeah, I think this has been a very intriguing conversation, Mr. Chair, and looking at some of the lessons from the transportation side, how they could apply to water makes a lot of sense. And I think that was one of the key underlying principles that's made the transportation process successful, is that the Department of Transportation is not limited to the facilities it owns or its specific roles and funding sources. It's really built that very big table to try to bring everybody together, recognizing, to Frank's analogy about how large the water needs are, but that, there needs to be some coordination on all the transportation needs statewide. And part of that is that collaboration and understanding roles and so forth. Setting up the strategic intermodal system was a very positive step forward in terms of better defining the state's role in transportation. And implicit in that was the understanding that would give a lot more flexibility at the regional and local level, particularly for local governments to do what is best for their own jurisdiction. Obviously, there are trade-offs involved, and each time they go through the process of identifying projects for the strategic intermodal system or updating the work program, there's always a little bit of that back and forth over what's important from a statewide perspective and what might be important from a regional perspective. And of course, many of the same facilities, the major interstate highways that are part of the strategic intermodal system are also very important in their region. So there is, there's always lots of discussion at the project level, but having that big picture vision of understanding roles and the collaborative process to work towards consensus is always gets to the right solution over time.
Frank, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I don't necessarily at this stage see it as trade-offs as local governments, or for that matter, the water management district or regional entities having to feel like they're going to lose control. That's always the big concern that I always hear is, you know, I've got my utility. I don't want you coming down and telling me how to run my utility. I don't think that that's what we're talking about. What we're talking about is saying, you need more tools. We need consistent funding. We need consistent programs that achieve the goals that we, through this plan, will set for the state. And so I see it much more as an opportunity to enhance the ability of the water management districts and the local governments, which currently are constrained with regard to raising revenues for water infrastructure, but give them the resources and the charge. Doug.
Yeah,
Doug?
and
Go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I've said this a bunch of times relative to all of this. You know, the one thing the most powerful part of all of this, I think, is the advocacy and the ongoing conversation that never stops. It has, for me, what I've learned over all these years of working with the Long Range Steering Committee and FTP is that that's exactly what happens with transportation. The industry behind transportation never rests because they know that there is this plan, there is this strategy, there's this advocacy that is nonstop, and they can build their industry around the model, if you will, or around the idea that the $11 billion that is programmed into our budget is going to be there at least for that much for the next couple of years. Water, as Frank pointed out, you know, if we have $1.5 billion to $2 billion allocated to our water program, that's a lot. And not that it's, you know, not that it's a small number, but in order to achieve the number that, you know, Frank points out that we're shy of, that advocacy side, that industry side just doesn't exist. And I think that, you know, something Frank and I have talked about and John have talked about for a long time is, if there's this constant dialogue going on about how do we advance water issues, policy, and all that to a point to where it's in some foreseeable future we will see the turn of the corner, if you will, for water quality and everything water. There has to be that built-in system to advocate. And Frank pointed out just a few minutes ago, where is the state advocacy at an advocacy level? And there isn't one. And so it's our hope that through this kind of structure, which works incredibly well for FDOT structure, our hope is that we can create that for water and make sure that water is, again, at the same table as transportation is.
Thank you, Commissioner. Jeff, before we wrap up, I know we've had on some other calls a discussion about where the incoming president and speaker are on water and these issues. Can you speak a little bit to that with regards to, yeah, I think these are pretty high priorities of our legislature now, especially with this one-time funding that's come in.
Sure. And you know, during last session, we did have one policy to assess the state's stormwater and wastewater needs that was pushed by the next speaker designate Paul Renner, you know, in House Bill 53. And right now, counties are required to assess the 20-year needs for water, for wastewater and stormwater. So I know that is one of several components. So I know this issue is on the forefront of the current leadership team, future leadership team, and it's something that we're going to continue to advocate for on the association's behalf. And Mr. Chair, we are getting close to that time of 1 hour. So, you know, I do see a few more questions from folks, but I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So if you want to close us out here, I know we'll have further discussion in Walton County at our 2021 FAC legislative conference on this issue.
Michelle, do you want to say anything before I close this out?
Well, you know, I never miss an opportunity to have my voice heard. I just want to say, Chair, I'm just so grateful to be on this committee, and to Commissioner Smith, who's been doing the yeoman's job here for years and years for this advocacy. And I encourage everyone to attend the workshop with us and the meetings next next week, and let's continue to move this forward and get what we need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And I want to thank the 30 or so participants that have given us, again, their time and attention. It's your most valuable asset, an hour on this. Thank you to our two panelists. This is, we are no longer at the beginning of this discussion. We are now firmly into the policymaking, and we'll start looking at some of the issues that came up in Walton next week. We'll hopefully start thinking about funding sources, processes, and where we as a committee and as a group of local leaders can take our responsibility for the water issues and ask the state to help us with planning for the next 20 years. I think that's really, really key. This isn't, we're not asking the state to give us money. We're asking the state to involve us and to set up processes so that the funding for this state, the economy and water is predictable. And what did Lisa say? That we're not in a quote, grab bag mayhem year after year after year. And so thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Commissioner Smith. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Vice Chair Calderon, and everyone that's participated today. Jeff, anything else to close us out?
Just to close out, thank you again, Frank, John, for great presentations, and commissioners for your participation in this discussion.
All right, y'all have a great day. See you next week.